Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Gives me great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Professor Janaki Nair, who, as we know, will deliver the series of 4 talks on the history of princely Mysore. Talks that focus on people who are, at one level, ordinary, peasants, workers, devadasis, nationalist rebels, but also extraordinary in the kind of resistance that they participated in. I'm not going to repeat the biographical details that are already on the website, but I would like to introduce Janaki Nair as a historian who has engaged deeply with so-called histories from below, the stories of those who are written out or leave little trace behind them in conventional histories. Her earliest work was as a labor historian, investigating the lives of workers in Bangalore and in KGF, work that formed the basis of her book, Miners and Mill Hands, Work, Culture, and Politics in Princely Mysore. Another of her books, Mysore Modern, Rethinking the Region Under Princely Rule, looks at the concept of modernity within the context of the princely state and the region and the wider region. She has written on the history of Bangalore and the social and economic forces that led to the creation of the city as it stands today in her book, The Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century. With that, I will hand over the floor to Janaki. I think she will speak for about an hour and take questions after that. Janaki, over to you.
Let me start by thanking BIC for this wonderful opportunity to share work that I have done over the last few decades, 4 decades actually, with a general audience. And I must particularly thank Ravi Chandar, I hope he is here already, for having pursued me with such diligence and patience ever since I returned from exile 5 years ago, and also to the current team at BIC for holding me to that promise, and especially Thomas Abraham for what he has enabled. Usually the masterclasses are only 3. BIC has been kind enough to allow me to extend it to 4 because I felt 4 is a good number of, unusual figures to speak about. But there is another reason I'm particularly grateful to BIC for having given me this opportunity, for giving me as a professional historian this opportunity at a time when historical claims, as you know, have been proliferating, sometimes at the cost of the historical method. So let me also start by saying that when I was thinking about what to focus on in my modest corpus of writings over the last few decades and on princely Mysore, I was urged by 2 younger colleagues, Divya Kannan and Hemant Kidambi, to focus on subaltern figures and on social history. So I was really grateful to them for steering me away from what would have been another set of lectures. So, what this set of lectures is doing is sharing the power of microhistory, and I hope this series will also illuminate a region, which is Mysore, the princely state of Mysore, that is, as it formed a part of what is now Karnataka. And I take this series as an opportunity, and I want to say this right at the outset, to do what someone called Jacques Rancière described as exploring that shameful kinship between history and storytelling. Now, I want to make sure that you understand, I'm not saying that history is storytelling, but that it is a powerful way of communicating certain kinds of historical truths. And I'll do this through focusing on these emblematic figures who were poor, marginalized, who were tragically defeated even in some cases. And I saved them, therefore, I hope, from the enormous condescensions of history and from the historical imbalances of documentation. Broadly, the series is following a chronology. So I start today with the earliest of these talks in the 1830 period, moving to just before independence. And I want to also emphasize that this first talk is work in progress, so there may be loose ends which I have not quite tied up, and I hope to do so in the next few months. The other 3 talks are based on already published articles, and of course those of you who are interested in seeing longer versions may consult those written versions. I want to say a word or two about sources before I begin, and it has already in some ways been mentioned by Sandhya. As a social and political historian who has long written about this region, with an interest especially in documenting the lives of the marginal, the voiceless, the poor, and so on, but not necessarily historyless. That's the emphasis I'm making. I don't believe that archival silence means historical absence, like many of my colleagues in social history. But in a society where writing even today continues to be something of a social privilege, and certainly this would have been true 2 centuries ago, it would have been true even 1 century ago, it is of course difficult to find sources which allow us to access the ways in which the peasant or the worker or the Devdasi actually thought about their conception of the world and how they sometimes chose to alter that world. So we rely for the most part on official sources. We rely on the government inquiry, the legal trial, the judgment, the disputations of colonial officials, occasionally anthropological writings by colonial officials themselves, where you have this insurgent peasant or the rebellious worker or the nationalist rebel speaking because, not out of choice, but because out of their involuntary collision with the apparatuses of the state. They are forced to speak. They are forced to speak about themselves. And this has in some ways been a boon to those of us who are researchers of social history. The state's inquisitorial zeal is exactly what allows us a small kind of insight into who these figures may have been, what their lives were like, and so on and so forth. So it is our task, and I want to emphasize this right at the outset, to read this voluminous official judicial prose against the grain. That is to say, to distill with a certain kind of empathy what these figures might have thought, to discover the voice of the subaltern, as it were, not in order to speak like the judge. So the historian does not speak like the judge, does not necessarily speak like the official looking to quell the rebellion. It doesn't look or speak like the policeman who is detecting a crime and so on and so forth, but we do that in order to uncover another kind of voice of subaltern folk. And I feel it important to emphasize this method right at the outset. It's a common knowledge for students of history, particularly of those who are doing advanced degrees in history. But I'm emphasizing it because we inhabit a time when the professional historian, as you all know, is the most beleaguered and the most derided in a minefield that is thronged with historians and historical claims from those who are aggressively demanding a past that is, often strains our credulity, actually, but also because the historical protocols are sometimes eclipsed by their morally triumphant historical narratives. I want to emphasize that what I'm going to do in these 4 lectures is not to fight shy of recounting these sometimes tragic ends to which these struggles came. I will not fight shy of outlining the false hopes or the ambiguities of these subaltern actions. I don't want to emphasize or amplify only their heroic stances. My interest is more in developing new criteria of historical proof, especially suited to the chaos and uncertainties of our times. So, what would these new standards of evidence look like, and can we just avoid falling into some kind of absolute relativism? And I hope that what I say will illustrate this perhaps a bit better. Okay, so now on to my insurgent peasant, which is the subject of today's talk. On August 23rd, 1830, and I'm going to show you here a map. First, let me show you the map of where we locate Mysore in the 1820s, when the conquest of India is not yet complete, but where Mysore at least has a definite shape. And you can see its location within the subcontinent. This is important for us because you can see that Mysore is a landlocked state. It has boundaries, and I'm going to speak about the boundaries in just a moment. But the event with which I open this account happens on August 23rd, 1830, when the riots, that is to say the peasants of Chennagiri, issued a proclamation saying that the Amaldar had greatly oppressed them. Among other things, he had set a house on fire and he had murdered its owner for the recovery of revenue dues. They claimed that there was no redress that could be obtained, that it was impossible to continue in a country where there was no justice, and called upon the inhabitants of the country to join them in insurrection in the proportion of, and they even had worked out the details of how the insurrectionary force would be constituted, 1 man per house, to bring with them in custody all the public servants, to stop all revenue collections, prevent the importation and exportation of goods. Okay? So the riots of Chennagiri sparked off a series of events which had very, very grave consequences, presented the most serious challenge to the Rajah of Mysore and his rule, eventually leading to his removal and the imposition of direct British rule. So this rebellion had major consequences for the future of Mysore as a state. And it also revealed acute hostility to this new extractive agrarian regime and the unbearable excesses that were perpetrated on the peasants. Now, just some months earlier, I'm just trying to remember what, so I'm just showing you a map. Again, this map is actually not yet complete because there were so many sites for this rebellion. So this is only giving you a suggestive idea of where the sites of the rebellion were. Most of them were around the city, which was then known as Nagara. It's still known as Nagara. But you can see that it spreads way down to the south and also to the east. A few months earlier, in April 1830, there had emerged on the horizon a man whom the colonial records would describe as a pretender, Budi Baswappa Naik, claiming to be the long-lost descendant of the Nagara dynasty, which had been wrested from the Queen Veeramaji by Hyder Ali in 1763. Hyder Ali takes over Bangalore, which was the name of the city, renames it as Hyder Nagar, and then subsequently it is simply referred to as Nagara. The new Nagar Khawand, who came literally out of nowhere, sprang up from nowhere, claimed to have received the auspicious insignia, the seal ring of this Nagara dynasty, from an itinerant Jangam, that is to say a Lingayat monk, a Swami, and he traced his ancestry to the former queen's adopted son. So he claimed to be the son of the adopted son. There's a whole story about Veeramaji, which I'm not going to go to in the interest of time, but those of you interested can read an article I've written about it. The inquiry would establish him as Sadara Malla, although his mother later speaks about him using a different name, who had been jailed for his hand in robberies in the Kannada region. But he was, upon his release, had reinvented himself and established himself as Budi Baswappa Naik. He had, by this time, matted locks, but he was described as the wealthy or prosperous Rajah of Nagara. And this Amaldar who writes this note to the Gaudas of this region say that you must arrange Budi Baswappa Naik's marriage by providing all the things that he needs, supplying all the items that he needs in grand style. Budi Baswappa Naik is actually marrying the daughter of a Nargund merchant, and he is then issued a letter in which he is formally installed as the Rajah of Nagara. And thereafter, he travels around the region and he himself issues a communication in which he assures the peasants, who by that time are already in ferment, of freedom from their miseries, from the reduction of revenue remission. He's promising them all manner of reductions and freedoms from the troubles to which they were subject. Now, this is not something that he achieved easily. So the people of Nargund, who suspect that he is an impostor, actually thrash him and say, where did you get this ring from? And then he has to convince them that he has actually been given this ring by a respectable Jangam and so on and so forth. But he wins that round, and he actually is able to establish himself as the leader of this region. But he is soon joined, and by the 29th, so you can see the proliferation of these sites. I've marked here 3 or 4 different locations. One are the forts, some of which were occupied by not just the peasants, but by the polygars, who also joined the struggle at this time. The peasants who were gathering in what were called kutams. And these were like kutams, meaning assemblies, averaging between 2 and 3 and sometimes even 6,000 people. So imagine this, rural people being gathered together in this protest and being asked to actually defy the Rajah's Sarkar. By this time, the kutams, which is probably the more non-violent aspect of their rebellion, was already deteriorating into forms of violence. In Budihal, for example, the large body had already attacked the public treasury, and they had committed violence against the faujdars, compelling the amildars to restore the money that had been extorted from them in excess. By December, the peasants of Holihanur, having failed in more peaceful forms of protest, surrounded the faujdar in kutams of 3,000, demanded that the amildar be delivered to them, raided the fort, and this time they are also armed with slings and arrows, but eventually they were chased away. Incidentally, I should tell you that I could not find any visual representation of this rebellion in any form, so I have borrowed the woodcut of Somnath Hor of Tebaga, which is more than a century after 1830. Just for your information, it's the black and white slide at the back. There are no traces of visual elements that can be used here. Plundering had begun on the highways, and there were attacks on forts by the peasants who molested their authorities. Now, the interesting thing that happens is, how did these kutams gather? I mean, we are talking about not a small group of people, but thousands. How did they gather, and what was the basis on which this disaffection was begun to be noticed by the colonial authorities? You can say, I've put this on a slide so that you can follow it easier than my reading it out, that the disaffection has been very general, and the head patels of taluks, most of whom were Gaudas, by the way, were congregated in bodies called kutam, 2,000 or 3,000 riots in each. The parties corresponded with each other. Now, we're talking about largely illiterate people, and they are actually responding to a correspondence, letters which have been issued by the Nagar Khawend. And they are all showing great willingness to defy the authorities. And you can see that the defiance is taking many forms. They're stopping the Rajah's post, the Tapal. His nirups have been torn and destroyed. Amaldars were generally placed in restraint. Their seals of office have been taken from them. They have been beaten. They have been ill-used. The Sarkar treasuries have been seized by the Patels, and merchants and travelers arrested by several gangs of insurgents, and money forcibly levied from them. And it was found that delaying your measures to control this rebellion would only result in its spread and would be fatal to the tranquility of the region. Now, the first sort of question that I want to raise here is this question of how this message was transmitted. So I'm actually going to go forward a little bit to say that, okay, so just let me give you the timeline here so that we get that out of the way. By December, another set of people had joined the rebellion, and that were the disgruntled polygars, particularly the polygars of Tarikere, which is one of the most lively regions of this Shimoga region. And they were going, Rangappa Naik was the name of the head polygar of Tarikere, and his 3 sons. They were moving about from Durg to Durg. They were going from fort to fort. So if I can go back to the map here, you can see that they were actually trying to take possession of various forts. They'd taken possession of the fort of Kamandurg, and they claimed that they had not just hundreds, but thousands of followers who were armed. So by this time, it is not just slings and arrows, but it's also matchlocks, guns that are entering into the fray. And by this time, also the troops are marching from Bangalore to try and quell the rebellion in Kaldurg, Vastara, Shikaripur. Aid has been sought from the East India Company for sending their troops as well. After all, that was why they were in this relationship with the Rajah. Now, what happens in a later period, by about, say, January or February of 31, is that the scene of action moves from the forts, which are easier and more difficult to defend in a sense, because the British and the Mysore troops can easily take over the forts, and they retreat into the jungles where to stage a certain kind of guerrilla warfare, which is much more difficult for British troops to penetrate. So you can see the green regions here, which are more forested regions of the Malnad area, into which these people are actually retreating in order to continue their rebellion. But the interesting question to ask about this, because it had deployed, because it sort of mobilized such large numbers, is to ask how was it. I'll come to the question of how the message was actually distributed and spread. But let me first start by talking about the fact that it concerned the British greatly, that the main difficulty that they saw was that they had to sort of be able to pin it down to some kind of leadership, which was a little difficult, even though there was the Nagar Kavind, there were the polygars and so on and so forth. They therefore, after the major part of the rebellion was quelled in, say, April of 1831, they declared that they will no longer allow Krishna Raja Wodeyar to be the Rajah. He was then called only Rajah, not Maharaja, of Mysore, and that it would be taken over by the British directly. And so this is the communication which is passed on to the Amildars, Zamindars, polygars, Amils, Karnams, Riots, etc., to say the East India Company is now in control, and that we will now be directly administering this region. We will assume the management of this region. But all these communications were not necessarily leading to the suppression of the rebellion. And just for you, I mean, I don't want to go into too many of the details, but there were rebellions continuing right through 1831, well into 1832, and I'll come into the question of who was rebelling even in 1832, continuing into the British-ruled territories of South Canara from 1834 and continued till 1837. Mark Cubbon had to actually quell a polygar who was rising in rebellion even in 1849. So it was not a rebellion which was easily controlled even as early as 1831. It continued for several years after. Why Bedanur, that is to say Nagara? Why did it start there, and what was the compelling historical reason for it to have its origins in the city of Nagara? And there is an interesting communication here which shows, first of all, let me tell you how arbitrary are the borders of states and how arbitrary are the borders of nations. We should all learn this lesson, really speaking, because what comes up at this point is a clear indication that Nagara had never been part of the old Mysore kingdom. What the Mysore kingdom that was constituted in 1799 carved out of Tipu's dominions. First of all, it didn't even coincide with Tipu's dominions because Tipu was defeated and his territories were given to directly ruled by the British to some part of the Marathas and also to the Nizam. So, but Nagara had always had a certain distance from the Mysore Raja. And they see, the British looking at this rebellion in the 1830s, see that one of the reasons for this rebellion striking root in Nagara is because after it was subdued by Hyder, and it was denominated Hyder Nagara, and although that was conquered by Hyder, the Bangalore did not belong to the ancient territory of the former princes of Mysore, and therefore they never felt they owed any loyalty. As a matter of fact, the people of Nagara, and especially the polygars, believed that when the British defeated Tipu Sultan, they would be in turn reinstalled as independent kingdoms. So it is the memory of that possible independence that is actually driving a part of this rebellion. This is actually from, as I said, from the official records. And when you look at one of the first petitions that the peasants of Nagara are actually presenting to the British, written very eloquently, you can see that they are talking about their dominion as something that is independent, something that is worth saving. And let's also pay attention to one very important sentence which recurs in many of these peasant petitions, which is that they were, in the days of Nawab Bahadur Tipu, we were in a state of happiness. I'm coming to this because even though Tipu's regime was a military fiscal regime, which was equally extractive. I'm not denying that Tipu's regime was not extractive in the same way that the British / Mysore regime was. He at least had a standing army which put a certain kind of pressure on the market to be able to supply grain for the army and to be able to pay for that as well. So there was an active demand for grain in Tipu's time, which the riots actually remember as something that actually enabled their economic prosperity. And they're recalling this when they speak to the British. Whereas under the Maharaja, under the Rajah, the Faujdars don't understand revenue affairs. They are simply collecting money, and if we delay paying for even 1 or 2 days, then they torture us, they extort bribes. Besides this, they ask us to pay revenues on wastelands. They really oppress even those who have left their land and gone away. And there was also an oppression in the form of free labor, which was extracted from these peasants. So all this is kind of documented and presented to the British. And I want to say that this petition does not ask for British rule. They are asking for independence from the Rajah of Mysore. They are not asking for British to take over and to rule them. They're saying, save us from the Rajah. So they're rebelling against the Rajah, but they're not necessarily asking for company rule, which is what they get. And here again you can see in Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan's time, although the servants of the government were accustomed to exact from the riots a larger assessment than was due, yet since the standing army was considerable, the grain was sold at a very good price, and therefore, the riots were in a thrifty condition. But look at what one riot, you have many leaders speaking, but I've chosen the one testimony of a riot himself, where he is describing the kinds of oppressions to which he was subject in order to impress on the British that what had happened under the Rajah was completely unacceptable. There were taxes which were unbearable. There were taxes for each plowshare that was purchased, for every coconut brought into a feast, for every head of cattle sold. And they were forced to take additional land on increased rents, pleading their inability to pay rents, that their cattle were prevented from going from village to graze, and they had to, succumb to whatever the amaldars actually exacted. They could exact straw, they could exact firewood, they could exact, as I said, free labor as well. And in addition to all this were the kinds of harassments from the merchants. So Nagara, just for your information, I don't want to go too much into the agrarian history here because I'm sticking to the events of this particular rebellion. But it is a region which is actually dominated by rice cultivation, betel nut, and to some extent tobacco as well at this time, for which the merchants came and they used to harass the women and the children. There was harassment all around, which is what they are protesting against. The Rajah decides to issue his own nirups in which he claims that, you have to stop all this now. I'm the king and I'm going to tell you that you should now. Here's a curious thing that comes up. He says, all persons who should go about with horns and leaves for the purpose of creating assemblages of people under the name of a coot should be seized, tried, and if committed, hanged immediately without hesitation. His response was very, very harsh, and that he asked for a report to be submitted to him and for his orders to be obeyed. But his orders were in fact not being obeyed. That was what the rebellion was all about. But I'm drawing your attention here to the fact that he specifies that people should not go about with this insignia of the rebellion, which is horns and leaves. And we'll learn a little bit more about this as a sign of the rebellion as it is passing from village to village. We don't know completely whether this sign is actually a form of a threat. So I'll just show you a few quotations from people who talked about what place this. These are margosa leaves and bones and horns. These are the three kind of elements of this communication. In some cases, mention has also been made of slippers. Now, this is a mixture of both auspicious and inauspicious things. Margosa leaves, as you know, are auspicious. Bones and horns and certainly slippers are inauspicious. So what is this mixture of signs doing in terms of communicating the message of the rebellion? Is it that it's striking fear that you will actually lose caste, or you will become yourself inauspicious if you actually participate in this, if you don't participate in this rebellion? You can see that all the people who are speaking about those elements are talking about it as if it is a bad omen, as if it is something which will lead to the loss of caste. So it is difficult. I have been trying to find out what this might signify. The British, interestingly enough, in their accounts say that this is customary practice during peasant rebellions. And there is no evidence provided for that. There is no anthropological evidence provided for that. It is customary in Mysore for such articles to be distributed and circulated in order to actually declare rebellion. It is customary. It is customary to gather in kutams. It is customary, is what they say. And this is really quite interesting that they are, Now, what I don't want to get distracted by the fact that this might have some kind of impact that is, creating fear, because fear alone cannot account for the very, very large numbers that we are seeing are gathering. And I want to, remind you of the map I showed you, not just large numbers, but large numbers across the entire state of Mysore. What is happening here is an interesting kind of inversion of the kinds of atrocities to which the riots have been, exposed. So I showed you the discussion that a Mulugani riot actually, the peasant called Mulugani actually declares was his experience under the Amaldars, a very harsh experience. What they in turn do to the officials whom they seize is to inflict the same kinds of punishment on them. So here is Seshagiri Rao, who has been seized by the riots and they beat him and say, you're only a man, we are also men, you caused us to be beaten, and therefore we will now give you a thrashing. Take due note of the smarting and throbbing of the blows that we inflict. It is the very, cathartic moment of revenge, as it were, at this moment, trying to say, we experience such harsh punishments, now you will suffer in our hands. And then he says, you were paraded about on a palanquin, you slept on a soft couch, you had an umbrella carried over you like a very royal person, and you showed no pity on us poor people. So saying, they beat him, gave him a vessel, and made him cook his own rice and eat, what is more humiliating, and asked him to clean his own vessel thereafter as well. And then they gave him a rough kambli, which is what the peasants used to sleep on, saying, here, you slept on a soft cotton bed, but now you see the difference between that and sleeping in a kambli. And restore to us all the money that you have extorted from us. So this, I'm just giving one example. There were innumerable examples of this form of revenge. I don't want to call it revenge. It was a form of justice. It was a form of peasant justice, wanting to actually claim back some of their dignity through inflicting certain kinds of violence. So there is a certain law to this violence. There is a certain justice to this violence, particularly when you consider that the violence of the law, which is inflicted on them by the Rajah, is extremely harsh. So here you have the Rajah actually approving to his deputy, Ashraf Ali Khan, the steps that he has taken. What has Ashraf Ali Khan done? He has hanged close to 99 people who participated in this rebellion as an exemplary form of justice. To say, you go ahead and hang Shivalinga also, all these leaders. Go ahead and hang and cut off the noses and ears of persons deserving it. So this is the other form of punishment that is inflicted on those who participate in this rebellion, that their noses and ears are cut off, and therefore spread the fear of the Sarkar. So the violence inflicted by the peasants actually looks very pales in comparison to what is actually being inflicted on them by the Rajah himself. And the British are not very much far behind. They also are engaging in summary trials and hangings as exemplary measures. Of course, the only virtue which they keep claiming is that they actually hold a trial before they actually hang the men. But nevertheless, the hanging happens. But this rule of law that you actually have some form of a trial. It's not that the Rajah didn't have a trial. He had a panchayat as well to tell him who could be killed and who should not be killed. But there's always some way in which these acts of violence by the peasants are somehow being exaggerated in order to inflict even harsher punishment on them. This rebellion is happening as a consequence of what one might detect is a triple crisis. There was, of course, at this time a failure of rains. There was an epidemic of cholera, which is taking lives at this time in Mysore. And as I said, more importantly, there is this lack of effective demand for the produce of these peasants. There is, in that sense, a triple crisis to which these peasants are actually exposed. But the polygars joining in, as I said, is a sign of their wanting to actually explore the possibility of their return to a certain kind of independence. They're hoping that what the British will do through their interventions is to actually restore their independence. Remember that many of these are polygars who are actually being pensioned by the British after the defeat of Tipu Sultan in order to prevent precisely this kind of rebellion and claim for independence. But of course, this has obviously not succeeded, and that's why they are very harsh in wanting to actually round up Rangappa Nayak, round up his son Surjappa Nayak. Surjappa Nayak is actually hanged. Many of these Nayak polygars are eventually hanged. And what we have here is a sense that the polygars are the ones who are actually, there's a lot of traction that they have amongst the people of this region. They continue to exercise a certain kind of influence. They continue to be held in great, in honor. And they are writing fairly strong statements like this. For example, I'll just read it. I don't have it on a slide. I will plunder and lay waste the whole country. And as proof that I am earnest of what I say, let this blood be witness. And so saying, he took and cut our fingers over the letter, and that is the cause of the blood you see. So the person who's actually communicating these letters, taking them from place to place, is actually sworn to a certain kind of loyalty through actually shedding some drops of blood on the communication itself. But let us remember one thing. All this is happening after several months in which the peasants have been actually petitioning the Rajah and not getting a response from him. They have been petitioning the Rajah, saying, look, the Amaldars are extremely cruel, extremely extractive. You have to do something about saving us. We are sometimes left with no subsistence. But the Rajah is completely unresponsive. And this is the reason why the rebellion actually takes the form that it does. And we see, as I said, this law of violence that exposes that exerts itself. Now, but it doesn't end there. The story actually spreads to other parts of the state and reaches Bangalore, where the cry that is given is not of the peasantry so much, but of religion in danger. And the religion in danger story is happening in 1832, much later. You know, this discontent is manifested amongst the troops that are stationed in Bangalore. Before this, I want to say that the Kandachar peons who are actually asked to quell the rebellion are themselves deserting and moving over to the polygars. So there is all kinds of movement happening which makes the troops of the Mysore army also unreliable. In April 31, they have about 1,500 of these Kandachar peons are going over to the polygars. And the reason is very simple. They have not been paid their salaries for at least 6 months, and they feel that, you know, this is really something that is unacceptable. And so we'll go to whoever it is who can guarantee us our sustenance. Mark Cubbin, who later on becomes the commissioner of Mysore, was very astute in recognizing that the Kandachar peons are nothing but peasants in uniform. They are people who basically are peasants themselves, and therefore they have a great empathy for the position of the riots, and therefore their loyalties can easily be swayed. But the sepoys of Bangalore, that is to say the people who are employed by the East India Company, were themselves perceiving a very different kind of threat in this moment of flux. And they saw an opportunity for expressing their unease about what British rule could mean. They saw British rule as ushering in a period of conversion to Christianity. They felt that their mosques and masjids are under attack, and they will soon be all converted to Christianity. And the important need of the hour is actually to save that religion, to plant, as it were, the green flag on the Bangalore fort. And this rumor is actually gathering force through the Bangalore cantonment and in Closepet, which is close by. And how better can this monstrous plan of the British be exposed than by staging one act of desecration. So the act of desecration that is staged is the killing of a pig on the Eidgah Maidan in Bangalore. A similar desecration happens at Sirsi in Canara a little later. It becomes an opportunity for imagining another order, to emphasize, as I said, that religion itself is at risk. And so there is this event in which the pig was slaughtered, its blood was scattered about, sprinkled, a cross was struck on the Eidgah Maidan, pointing to a certain kind of Christian conspiracy, and the Christians as the authors of this particular abomination. There was a there was mounting irritation amongst the sepoys, and there was a lot of talk about a possible mutiny. There are 4 mutinies that happen in just a period of 2 months. So that's why I say, I said in the introduction to this lecture, in the short note that I circulated, there are many elements of this particular rebellion that bear striking resemblance to 1857. And the sepoy mutinies are, of course, eventually came about in 1857 more successfully. But here there are many sepoy mutinies that are taking place, small conflagrations, for different kinds of reasons, as I said. So this is the list of complaints that the British are now laying at the door of the Mysore Rajah to say that, look, your troops and soldiers are unpaid. They are, they are themselves attacking riots in order to meet their substance. The debt that you've got into is greater than ever, and there is more extensive deterioration that is expected. Therefore, half your dominions are in insurrection. So this is the British charge, that you are not ruling your kingdom properly, and therefore we feel we need to intervene, because the kinds of charges that were put against the Rajah was that he was distributing very rich garden lands and rich resources to people who were his favorites. He was favoring the Brahmins, and I'm going to come to that in just a moment, in the appointments to all the high positions. He was actually spending a lot on personal glory, jewelry, paintings, and so on and so forth, especially jewelry and very rich clothing. And of course, he was patronizing concubines. He was morally suspect as well. All of these were seen as problems for which he was clearly not listening to the warnings that had been issued by people like Thomas Munro in 1825, had told him, look here, you better, stop this kind of profligate spending and make sure that our subsidy is paid on time. I'm going to come to the question of subsidy a little later, but just to say that in order to meet his own, needs, the Rajah had instituted in 1817 a system which was called the Shirti Muchalika system, by which actually the revenues of particular taluks were auctioned to the highest bidder. So the highest bidder would go to these regions and extract as much as they could from the riots, send a portion of this back to Mysore, but by and large, not a large part was reaching Mysore. So the revenues were also dropping. And that was the reason why the Kandachar peons were in arrears, the amaldars were unable to do anything except through this extra economic coercion, and so on and so forth. What you have here is a significant feature of this movement, which is a protest against certain kinds of caste hierarchy. So if the Bangalore sepoys were gripped by the fear of religion in danger and also seized by this vision of a new order, the peasant rebellion revealed opposition to entrenched and unjust social hierarchies. Now, let me start with the anomaly. When a Brahmin called Kusaya was placed in custody in early 1831, the person who places him in custody, Basapaji Arsu, he asks the Rajah what is to be done with this Brahmin. And the Rajah reacts with outrage, because he says the riots have assembled in consequence of their complaints. So that's justifiable. This fellow is a Brahmin. What reason had he to take part with them? He was formally employed by the Sarkar as a Surishtadar, and therefore I order that he be confined. Now, this was in complete contrast to the torrent of complaints and eventually attacks that were made on Brahmins in Nagara and surrounding areas. So, here's what one testimony said, that, we were flourishing in the time of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, but the misery that has come on us after the Rajah's government has taken place is because Brahmins alone have filled the offices of Amaldar. The whole country is filled with Brahmins, and Brahmins were never punished, whatever offenses they might have committed. Major Clemens said, the one general feeling of disgust and hatred was expressed by all the inhabitants against the Brahmins. Riots detested the Brahmins on account of their oppression, their overpowering influence at court. All the public officers, I'm citing different authorities now, but I'm just doing it in the interest of time. All the public officers in the country were filled with Brahmins, to the exclusion of all other castes, that the Brahmins enjoyed lands at diminished rents while they increased the rents of others. They made the riots pay for wastelands, cheated them on the division of the crop, exacted unpaid labor from them, and when the riots carried their complaints to Mysore, they used to be confined and sent back to their taluks. So they were really hostile to the Brahmins who filled every situation. Now, who were these Brahmins? Most of them, just again shorthand, were Maratha Brahmins who had come into Mysore partly in the time of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, and who had actually enjoyed quite a high status. As you know, Purnaya himself was a Maratha Brahmin, and who therefore enjoyed quite a high status in the state and had been reinstated in many cases even after the defeat of Tipu Sultan. Many of them had 10, 7 members of their family working in the high echelons of bureaucracy, and they were all uniform in their oppression of the peasants. So this was seen as something that needed to be opposed. To the extent that Brahmins, 19 of them were actually hanged by the Nagar Kavind, and the British felt that this is actually now amounting to Brahminicide. He said, if this continues and if we don't actually intervene, so they publicly hang one of the peasant leaders called Mara Naik, and they say, if we didn't hang him, there would have been more Brahmins who would have been eliminated, because the people's blood is actually boiling with rage against these Brahmins and their occupation of the positions of power and their manipulation of positions of power. Caste was the register on which many peasant antagonisms were expressed. And let us not forget that the Patels are usually Gaudas or Lingayats. Many of the riots are Lingayats themselves, but also other castes. But caste was also that which explained the behavior of certain groups. So here's what the British say about the Kandachar peons. He says they are all bathers, bathers being hunters. And their habits and their religion differ materially from those of other Hindu classes in Mysore. And when unchecked by authority or discipline, they are predatory and intractable. So the reason for certain kinds of revolutionary behavior is actually attributed to caste. In this case, of course, it is Vedas are more a tribe than a caste. But we need not, I'll come to that point in just a minute. But the other people who were singled out for their role in this rebellion were the Jangams. The Jangams, as Kaban said, have always been a turbulent and intriguing class. And there are no doubt, and are no doubt as ready now as they were under their native princes to stir up sedition. The Jangams were actually harboring the peasants. And that's why in my map, if you noticed, certain mathas which actually participated in this rebellion, notably the Chitradurga Matha harbored some of the rebels, the Mananseri Matha in Kadur, and the Siddaramaya Matha of Shravanur. All of these were singled out as mathas which actually harbored peasant rebels. Peasants were dragged out of these mathas and summarily executed, but the Jangamas did their bit in actually trying to protect and these peasants. So the Jangamas were another group who were singled out as a caste, but their caste itself was something that opened the way to forms of sedition. Now, I don't want us to go away with this impression that everything was divided according to caste and the possibility of solidarity simply did not exist. That is not the case. You cannot have groups of 5,000-6,000 peasants gathering together if you did not have cross-caste alliances. And as one historian, Ramabhatta, has indicated, there were even attempts to do co-dining, as happened in August 1830 at Hosante. Co-dining, which is perhaps the most important aspect of cross-caste collaboration. There were Muslims, there were Gaudas, there were Lingayats, there were Bedars, all of whom were actually participating in this rebellion and were brought together as a consequence of very material difficulties that they had experienced. So we shouldn't allow this caste discussion which takes place here to distract us, as it were, from the very real class solidarities that were clearly happening at this moment. I think I have about 5 minutes left, so let me just see if I can wind up this discussion by talking about, going to my last section and talking about what is it, how do we understand this rebellion? Okay, so this is what the British actually impose on the Maharaja. He becomes, as it were, a pensioner of the British himself on a 1 lakh pension, 1 lakh star pagodas per annum, and 1/5 surplus revenue to be paid to him. And the British take over direct control of Mysore in 1831 October, and slowly established in degrees. By 1834, they are fully in place. How do we understand this rebellion? Let me come to the last part of what I want to say by saying, the sources tempt us to interpret the series of very dramatic events that changed the course of Mysore's history as a factional fight between these Maratha Brahmins and the Arsus, who, the Krishna Raja Wodeyar III, Mumbai, is actually sending some Arsu relatives to try and replace these Brahmin amaldars to see whether his relatives will actually perform a bit better and perhaps a bit more sympathetically to the peasants than the Brahmins against whom there are so many complaints. So one account has it that actually the rebellion is a result of this inter-caste kind of struggle between the Arsus on the one hand and the Brahmins on the other. And that actually the Brahmins, once more, were the culprits. They were the ones who actually set up this rebellion in order to get even with the Arsus who had been sent from Mysore. It's tempting to read it that way. And in fact, many historians, including very respectable historians, Sebastian Joseph, for example, have actually accepted this particular way of understanding. Or we can follow the colonial penchant for blaming the Rajah for his profligate spending on undeserving favorites. So, the Rajah had squandered the entire kind of treasure that Purnaya had actually got together, something like 73 lakhs pagodas. His own private debts stood at something like 12 lakhs. So he was deeply indebted himself to merchants, to moneylenders who were camping in Srirangapatna. I have followed the case of one such moneylender called Damodar Das, whose case went on for almost 60 years before it was finally resolved by being taken over by the state of Mysore and turned into a scholarship fund. But I've written about that, so I'm not going to discuss that here. But there were many such merchants and moneylenders to whom Krishna Raja Wodeyar was indebted. So the British felt it was Krishna Raja Wodeyar's personal bad behavior, if you like. The fact that he was indulgent, that he was giving favorites these jobs, he was favoring the Brahmins before he, decides to favor a few Arsus and so on and so forth. And that he's unable to make decisions which are firm. And yet he is cruel in a way that is unacceptable to the British as well. All of these, the East India Company minces no words in putting the blame squarely on Krishna Raja Wodeyar III. Now, but we have to understand what is the exact reason for his wanting to spend money on his favorites, as they are called. He is trying to establish himself as a sovereign king, unable to understand that under British rule, and particularly under this treaty which he has signed in 1799, which Mysore has signed. He was too young, he was 5 years old. he is actually beholden to the British for his position. He is not, in fact, an independent sovereign. He is somebody who is beholden to the British because you have to pay a subsidy of 24.5 lakh rupees annually in order to maintain the British force, to protect your borders. As I started by saying, even the borders of the territory of what was called Mysore were not actually the borders that corresponded to any former period of Mysore history, and certainly not any former period of Wodeyar history. So, the whole thing is arbitrary, and it is a gift, as it were, that the British are actually giving. I want to tell you an interesting thing, because, Pune was consulted at the time when Tipu was defeated, and the British were actually considering the possibility of installing one of Tipu's sons on the throne of Mysore. It was a possibility. And Pune actually tells the British that the Mysore kings have been more or less forgotten. It's 40 years now. So it is probably better for you to put a son of Tipu Sultan on the throne rather than to reinstall the Wodeyars. But of course, that is advice which is ignored. And not only do they put the Wodeyars back on the throne, but they also distance themselves from Srirangapatna. So they move the capital back to Mysore. And, every attempt is made to sever any link with Tipu and his family. That's another story which I'm not going to go into here. But I'm just saying that the Krishna Raja Wodeyar III, when he comes of age, when he turns 18 and he decides that Purna is standing in his way and he wants to take direct control of his territory, he does not realize that he is not in that sense an absolute sovereign. He's sharing a certain kind of sovereignty with the British. What he is trying to establish is a sovereignty of an older kind, where he is actually doling out, certain kinds of favors on certain people who will be loyal to him through these gifts, these inams, as it were. And therefore, he's got it wrong. And of course, he understands that he is beholden to the British for this war in which he did not participate. And yet, he was rewarded with the territory of Mysore. I'm saying all this because you can read the records in order to agree with the British that it is actually Krishna Raja Wodeyar's profligate spending that leads to this crisis. Or, and this is my preferred reading, we can listen to the voices of the peasants, the distress of the peasantry, and detect through their actions the hopes of building a new order, although it is perhaps a backward-looking one. So, they're rallying around the polygarch. They're rallying around the Nagar of Covent, who is promising them various kinds of concessions. Saket Rajan is probably one of those who's written the most comprehensive history of all these peasant rebellions together. But it is fatally marked by this fact that he wants to find in these rebellions anti-colonial, anti-feudal protests. They're not anti-feudal. They're not anti-colonial. The only anti-colonial protest that I have described to you today is the one that happens in Bangalore, where they actually feel that the British are responsible for imposing a certain kind of religious uniformity. Whether they were right or wrong is a different matter, but the fact that they actually thought that the British would actually impose a certain kind of, religious uniformity on the people of Mysore was probably the closest that it comes to anti-colonial. We are not talking about anti-colonial in the same way that you had, say, in 1857. But it is peasant rebellion. It is a consciousness of economic distress. It is rallying groups together in the name of this economic distress. But here, and this is the note on which I just want to again remind you of Mysore's location in the map of India, of the subcontinent. And I want to say that this is also a political protest. It's not just I'm not willing to use words like anti-feudal or anti-colonial, but it is a political protest insofar as they see their local oppressors as people who should be contested in various kinds of ways, including in the forms of justice that they perpetrate on their oppressors. We hear over and over again that the polygars and the insurgents are levying taxes. They are collecting taxes. They are actually installing an alternative government in these places. We don't want to romanticize the guerrilla warfare part, but there is no doubt that they knew this territory in a way that they could actually control it for a much longer period than the British actually imagined. So they could actually control and levy taxes, be able to, as it were, institute forms of government in these forest areas that had not been envisaged. Only one man, said one peasant, in 100 has the means of a decent subsistence. So there was a very acute feeling of a unity around the extremely harsh kind of economic circumstances to which the peasants had been reduced. So there were, many layers of opposition to the new regime. The composition of the service elite, as I said, the fact that they were all Brahmins, the fear of the loss of religion, the hope of another order, skepticism about the current Rajah. Who is this Rajah? In between it was said, he's not even a real Rajah, he's just a pot maker. We don't know how he's come to the throne. And why doesn't he come to Nagar to meet us? If he comes to Nagara to meet us, we will tell him. The fact that he is a remote presence, the fact that he is not somebody who is visible, the fact that he is flavoring his favorites and not actually doing anything for the peasants themselves, all of these are reasons why they see a reason for banding together and opposing this particular regime. But the interesting thing, this is the note on which I want to end, which I hadn't said so far at all, which is that neither the Nagara pretender, that is the Kavind of Nagara, Budi Basappa Naik, or the Patels, who were among the leaders of these Kutams, or the polygars, who were really arming the peasants and leading them in this revolutionary struggle, were able to communicate perhaps what was the biggest elephant in the room, if you like, which was the Mysore subsidy. The Mysore subsidy was imposed on Mysore at the time of signing of the treaty in 1799. It was a commitment of Mysore to pay 24.5 lakhs per annum at a time when Mysore's revenues were between 70 and 80 lakhs. Work it out for yourself. 1/3. 1/3 of the revenues would go as subsidy to the British to be able to station a set of troops in Mysore to prevent the possibility of any rebellion, from any attack from outside. Little did they imagine that the rebellion would actually happen within Mysore itself. Little did they imagine that they would have to use their troops against the Mysore people themselves, as happened in 31, 32, and so on, and right up until 37. So, and we cannot understand, I'm not going into that part of the rebellion, the spread of this rebellion to Canara, which continues from 1834 to 1837. There too, there are pretenders, not one, not two, but 3 pretenders, all of whom are rallying people to their cause. And that is a much more directly anti-colonial struggle. That's a much more directly anti-colonial peasant struggle which happens in Canara. But not so much in Mysore. In Mysore, I feel they are looking back at a time when there was a certain degree of independence. They're looking for a savior who will actually save them from very harsh revenue demands. And coming back to the question of a subsidy, Sebastian Joseph makes a very intriguing suggestion that one of the reasons the British imposed such a huge subsidy on Mysore, and I'll show you the comparative list in just a moment, was because they did not want the possibility of a real alternative emerging like Tipu Sultan. They did not want their rule to be challenged in any way in a state that had been its most indomitable enemy. It's an interesting speculation. I'm not sure I go fully with that particular speculation. But if you look at the amount that Mysore, just calculate it, it's like some 3,000 lakh rupees over a period of 148 years. If you look at the chart, Mysore dominates the payment of subsidy. So this is actually a chart that was prepared by Sir Mirza Ismail in the 1920s when he was the Diwan of Mysore, pleading with the British to reduce the Mysore subsidy, saying we need money for the development of Mysore. The British had, in 1881, when they handed the state back to Krishna Raja Wodeyar III, he was not alive at that, 1881, to his adopted son, they made Mysore promise to pay 35 lakh rupees, not 24.5, so an enhanced subsidy of 35 lakh rupees in order to compensate for what they believed were the enhanced revenues of Mysore by that time. A subsidy which Mirza Ismail argues has no basis anymore. It is irrelevant, it is archaic. It is not necessary to insist on the subsidy. He makes an argument. He doesn't succeed except that he manages to reduce it to the old 24.5 lakhs in 1928. But look at the list that we have here. Mysore is paying the largest amount. It is paying 40% of the direct subsidies that the British are collecting from the princely states. There are some princely states like Baroda which are not paying anything. So this question of unfairness is obviously right at the forefront. It is something that is actually not discussed or not brought up by any of the leaders of this rebellion. It cannot be brought up because it's the most, in that sense, it's the most commonsensical, I suppose, and therefore the most invisible in some ways. It's not something that even the Rajah is able to communicate to his people in any sort of, sensible way. So I end on this note by saying that the economic distress of the peasantry, whether due to structural reasons or to conjunctural reasons, is indisputable. There's no question that's what brought most of these people together in this massive rebellion. But I do not want to minimize the fact that there was a political consciousness also at play in this peasant rebellion. So I'm quoting here the person who has studied peasant rebellions very closely, Ranajit Guha, when he said that it would be quite in order to say that insurgency was a massive and systematic violation of those words, gestures, and symbols which had the relations of power in colonial society as their significator. So even if this peasant rebellion did not necessarily succeed in getting back, say, some measure of independence, even if they did not succeed, and in fact they paid a very high price, as you know, in terms of actual being killed and hanged and executed and so on, both by the Mysore troops and the British. They nevertheless, momentarily at least, revealed a face of a certain kind of political consciousness, a certain kind of understanding that we can have an access to another world, however momentary that might be. Thank you very much.
Do the disturbances become communal, given the fact that the man who is operationalizing the Rajah's demand is a Muslim? And if not, why not?
There is no evidence of any hostility between religions. Those who participated in the rebellion included large numbers of Muslims as peasants and as leaders themselves, supporters of the polygars. The Bar, the troops completely sided. The Kandachar peons went over to the polygars. The Bar Kacheri went over to the polygars, and Bar Kacheri was full of Muslims. So there was no hostility between Hindus and Muslims that one detects in any of the sources that I have looked at. The entire hostility was against the Brahmins and against the Maratha Brahmins. In this case, your question is interesting, But you know, Said Salar and all those, Ashraf Ali Khan, all of them are not necessarily seen as acting in the interests of their religion. They are acting on behalf of the Rajah, who is of course despised. But it's not boiling down to what their religious, particular religious faith was. The only point when the question of religion becomes foregrounded, as I said, is in the desecration event which happens in Bangalore. It happens also in Sirsi. And there are certain other kinds of moments when there is a dream of a possible return to Muslim rule that is entertained briefly. But this is again not something in which they are not able to draw other people in. So, I mean, I haven't gone into the details of this, but there are people who are drawn in. For example, the person who slaughters the pig is actually a Hindu. And he is, brought in to participate in this act. And likewise, there is this feeling that, you will have religious freedom if we have another order rather than the British. So there is a sense in which even the dream of a return to Muslim rule is actually promising religious freedom to even Hindus.
For an ordinary peasant, during those days, immediately after or just around Tipu's time, it would have made no difference who was sitting on top. Whether it is going to be Wodeyar or Tipu Sultan or somebody else, it just did not make any difference to them. I have lived in village. I have lived in village nearly 30, 40 years. Even today, they just don't bother. The village settlement, whatever it is bothered only about its oneself. And then the polygar is one region. I don't like to call it a polygar. I would like to put it in Kannada, Palyakara. That is the word which was used, and the British and others, all the educated people, changed it to polygar to make it convenient to them. You have one Munireddy Palya here, right here in Bangalore. There was also a Palyam. Palyam is a hamlet. So the person in charge of that is a Palyakara. Even today, if you go to a village, if somebody is acting big, first thing you will ask him is, Neenu Dodda Palygarna. When anybody knowing Kannada, you will appreciate it. Neenu Dodda Palyagara, Neen Bandu Nanu Helodu Anbuttu. It was not that. The hatred towards Palyagara was there. The polygars, for instance. I am not sure how the Brahmins came into this picture at all. Particularly, I am not sure how many of the Maratha Brahmins would have come into this. The fact that Marathas did come here. After Shivaji, quite a lot of Maratha invasion was here, but they did not come to that extent of usurping the other rights of these people. One Maratha Brahmin who I know is Mr. Sajan Rao. In Bangalore, you have a Sajan Rao circle, and he was one of the noted Maratha Brahmins. He is a Sajan Rao Naik, if anybody can correct me. His name was Sajan Rao Naik. So one of the Brahmins there. Otherwise, not many Brahmins from Maratha were given this. You can give me anybody can give me a name of any other Brahmin? Any other Brahmin? Yes, this is a question for that. So how do you put the Brahmins into this category of, you have the British, and you have the Tipu Sultans, and you have the Brahmins, when the polygars also had to be added to it. So what sort of distinction can you make on this?
I'll have to go back to repeat my lecture, because I think I've provided enough evidence of the fact that the testimonies themselves declared the Brahmins as the oppressors. They said it over and over again. The Maratha Brahmins dominated the bureaucracy. There were 35 amaldars in Mysore, and more or less all of them were occupied by Maratha Brahmins. There is name after name. Do you want to know the names? Seshagiri Rao, Sarottam Rao, Rama Rao. And Rama Rao had 10 members of his family who were occupying, positions of authority. And so on and so forth. I didn't want to confuse people with too many names, but I've also given the citations from my evidence. I will beg to disagree with you about the fact that peasants don't know who was at the top. They very much knew who was at the top when they were addressing their petitions from about February of 1830 right up until August when they first rose in rebellion. There was no response to their petitions, which were going to Mysore. The Rajah remained unresponsive. This was why they felt that they should take some action which would draw attention to their state. As I demonstrated, I hope, in my lecture, these actions changed from being simply gathering in kutams to attacking people with slings and arrows, to actually using muskets, and then finally engaging in acts of complete violence, including possibly attacks on, I gave you the example of Seshagiri Rao and what he was forced to do. So I don't agree with you at all that the peasants are in complete, in complete ignorance about who is in power. Almost all the petitions that were submitted seem to have a form of comparison with Hyder and Tipu's time. You may say that, golden ages always appear when things happen to deteriorate so badly that something previous to that appears to be a golden age. Whatever the reasons are, they are remembering Hyder and Tipu's time as more favorable to their status than their current rule of the Maratha Brahmins in every administrative position. That's the evidence from the records. Now, if you want to go by what you have encountered in current day Karnataka, that's a different. You're right. I'm glad you corrected me on polygars. I've used that term because that's the term that is used in the British records. They are polygars. And you're right. There are many references to polygaru in contemporary language as well. That doesn't mean that there is no recognition or understanding of who is in power, where, and what is happening. That's the argument I hope I have forcefully made, that there is actually political understanding. That political understanding is bringing people together in different kinds of ways. Some of it is anti-caste, like I explained, and that's very strong because that's who they were. And by the way, these Maratha Brahmins were employed by Hyder and Tipu as well. Many of them roll over into, they survived the regime change. They're rolling over into the Purnaya's regime. And just since the subject was raised, let me also add that one of the things the British realized that they had praised Purnaya so highly for his capacity to be an administrator which had managed not only to pay the subsidy on time, but also to accumulate a treasury of some 73 lakh pakoras, which, as they say, Krishna Raja Wodeyar squandered. But when they started speaking to the peasants, they said, maybe we have been a little too kind to Purnaya. He was as harsh, he was as extractive, and the peasants' condition has not improved in his time. His only concern was tranquility and paying the subsidy.
Yeah, you talked about how the rebellion spread and how they communicated with each other, that they wanted to rebel or what the issues were, and how did that communication work?
So the communication was twofold, and I explained that there were letters that were being signed by the Nagar Kavind and certain patels which were circulating, which asked people to contribute one person from each home and so on and so forth. So that was one level of communication. Obviously, for a largely illiterate population, these communications would have been read out and explained. But there was simultaneously the small token kinds of items which were circulating. The margosa leaves, the bones, the horns and so on, which were, as I said, it is ambiguous. It seems to be a kind of a duplex communication. It's both a form of communication, asking people to join in, so it's a secret kind of communication, a non-verbal, non-written kind of communication, non-epistolary as it were, but it is also a threat. So, it's simultaneously a communication and a threat, loss of caste, etc., or some kind of omen of bad times if you don't join in. I haven't been able to crack that because I have not been able to find out exactly what this bundle of items signified. I hope to be able to find out what this bundle of items. As I said, margosa leaves are usually auspicious, cleansing, they are, healthy, etc. So what is this combination of margosa leaf with bones and horns? What is it communicating is something that needs to be worked out.
Yeah, so thank you, Janki, for this fascinating lecture. One question has already been asked, the one which I was supposed to be asking. The other this is in spirit of knowing more on this theme. The role of mathas, if you can speak more on that, and keeping in mind how these mathas are in a way taking us to a socio-cultural story as well, to this larger economic-driven emphasis which you are providing for the political consciousness. Is there some sort of socio-cultural element which is probably driven from the mathas, and Lingayats being a non-Brahmin kind of ecclesions, and is there some sort of socio-cultural story of rebellion there? So that is one. And then if the short one, this significant. Okay, yeah.
That's a very interesting question you raised. There is a constant reference to the role played by the mathas, not just in this rebellion, but several other rebellions as well. And as Kaban says, they are seditious by nature. He's kind of attributing that possibility of sedition to the Jangamas themselves. Certainly they had a certain kind of caste link with the majority of the riots, most of whom would have been Lingayats, many of whom would have been Lingayats, especially in that region. But that's not the only reason. I think they had, so Lingayat mathas are not like Brahmin mathas in terms of them having a sort of socio-cultural interface. By definition, Kalburgi defines it as samajamukhi. He says, unlike Brahmin mathas, which are dharmamukhi, these are samajamukhi. They are society-facing. They, by definition, are engaging with society in different kinds of ways. From their very foundations, the Lingayat matha is quite different from the Brahmin matha. So there is a kind of engagement with the social that is happening, which is probably coming into play in this particular instance as well. A certain kind of empathy for the condition of riots and for harboring them in times of need, in times of distress, particularly in times of economic distress of the kind that I have explained. So there is something foundationally about the Lingayat matha that is society-facing. Whether it is engagement with education or whether it's engagement with dasoha, which is this mass feeding which happens, etc. So the various kinds of elements of this engagement.
Thank you, Janki, for wonderful 1.5 hours so far. I have 2 questions, actually. I'm going to ask them quickly. The first one was, sorry, only one. Okay, then I'm going to merge them together and be smart. Okay, so can I ask both and you answer just one? Is that okay, whichever one?
We can collect questions, Sandhya.
Okay, so the first one was, you said that the Maharaja was a remote presence. And the question was, did he ever go into the hinterlands of his state? That was the first one. And engage with people at ground level, or was it confined largely to Mysore? And the second was connected with the Mysore subsidy, which was, why was Gwalior paying nothing, Kashmir paying shawls, and Mysore so heavily, paying tribute?
Okay, shall we collect the questions?
Will you?
Yeah.
My question is similar. I was intrigued by the role of the mathas in sheltering the rebels, and was there any repercussion that followed from the British or say the Rajas that these mathas had to sort of face? Because I'm assuming that the mathas sort of had to go in tandem with the powers to be. So if you could just answer that.
Yeah, shall I just answer the last one first? You're right. They were singled out for not only just arrest in some cases, but also their funds were cut off. Okay, so that was one way in which they were punished. That's the answer to the Matha question. To Ali's question, it is uneven. And it is extremely uneven, and it is tempting, therefore, to go with Sebastian when he says, maybe they imposed this crippling subsidy because they simply did not want to see a resurgence of any kind of, possible, rebellion or threat to their rule. But it is arbitrary. I mean, it's like, it seems so arbitrary that there are states which don't pay anything. And Mysore, with the taxes, was paying something like 53% of the income of the British. Today we are still having this question of what Karnataka's contribution to the national exchequer is. And you can see how far back it goes. It's very interesting to see this. Yeah. I don't have an explanation for this unevenness. I don't have an explanation except that it is arbitrary, and it's it's the very nature of the arbitrariness of British rule and the kinds of arrangements that it made with different regions as they were conquered. And Mirza makes a very strong case, and he's therefore able to actually reduce it, even though he's not able to get rid of the subsidy altogether. Because they are arguing that, your revenues have increased, now it is 200 lakhs. So of course you have to give us 35 lakhs. But it doesn't make sense. We're paying taxes. You're doing all these things as well. The first question, just remind me. Yes, this is a very important question you asked, because actually under pressure from the British resident, Casa Major, Krishna Raja Wodeyar is forced to journey out of Mysore to go to Chenrayapatna. That's as far as he goes. He goes to Chenrayapatna and he says, I will speak to the peasants here. I didn't read to you that beautiful passage in which the peasants actually gather in thousands from Kikeri. The Kikeri peasants are standing there and they're saying, where's this man? Show us his face, and so on and so forth. And they're very, very obstreperous. They're beating their drums and sounding their trumpets. He is in conversation with the residents, so he says, this is all disturbing me. They're not showing me the kind of respect that is due to me. They are speaking to him as an equal. They are standing outside the door and beating their drums, sounding their bugles. So he says, take away their drums and their bugles, so that they can then be reduced at least in the noise level. And that's the time when that famous exchange about Kusaya happens, where he says Kusaya is actually imprisoned, and the Kikeri peasants go to Kusaya's cell or whatever he is imprisoned in, rattle the cage doors and the windows and say, we are with you because you have stood with us. We are even prepared to sacrifice our lives for you. But all this time, he is unable to. So he journeys to Chenrayapatna with gold, silks, and silver and so on. I don't know to whom he gives them, because all that the peasants get is betel nut and betel leaf and his blessings. But of course, that doesn't placate them. That doesn't placate them in the least. And the skepticism about his rule is extraordinary. I mean, people, as I said, the Nagara peasants are saying, bring him here, let him experience what we have experienced. We'll tell him what is what. But it doesn't happen. He doesn't journey that far. He goes only as far as Chenrayapatna and back to Mysore.
Janki, what caste are the Wodeyars? Like, are they Arasu? But
yeah.
What is Arasu? Was it, now it's a backward caste, was it? What was? What is it?
I'm hesitating to say this, but let me say it because that's what the records tell us. The Arasus were called, throughout the communications of the British, they were called Shudra. And there was a lot of opposition to that categorization of the Arasus. Until in 1927, it was officially decided to stop calling them Shudra. But meanwhile, what is happening, at least since Chamaraja Wodeyar X, who is the adopted son of Krishna Raja Wodeyar III, is that there is an attempt to forge a link with Rajputs to elevate themselves as Rajputs. Interesting, because it's the man marrying the Rajput woman. In this case, the Rajkumari Vana, who finally becomes Krishna Raja Wodeyar IV's wife. And this Rajput connection is constantly explored for the kind of, the kind of elevation that it brings to these kings. It is since independence and since Devrajars actually that the Ars have been classified as a backward class.
And Nagara, where is that exactly?
Nagara is in Shimoga district. It has a very fine fort even now, by the way. It's now a kind of a deteriorated village, but it is a very, very fine fort, which changed hands about 6 or 7 times during this rebellion. It went to the hands of the rebels, came to the hands of Mysore troops, went back to the rebels, and came back to the troops. I didn't have time to mention all these details. Very interesting details.
And a huge thank you to Janaki Nair for doing this.